The sky above Earth was no longer its own. Monolithic warships hung in low orbit, their metallic hulls reflecting the sun's light in sharp, menacing glares. The Galactic Empire had arrived, and with it came the end of human sovereignty. At least, that was what the invaders believed. Colonel Jack Reynolds stood in the dimly lit command bunker, his jaw tight, as he listened to the alien ultimatum repeating over the loudspeakers. The voice was emotionless, synthetic, translated into flat English by their machines. Surrender and be assimilated into the galactic dominion. Resistance is futile. Your outdated weaponry cannot harm us. Compliance ensures survival. Rebellion ensures eradication. The message looped. It had been playing for 3 hours. Reynolds exhaled through his nose, arms crossed over his broad chest. Around him, his men absorbed the words in silence, each processing the grim reality in their own way. Captain David Deacon Hayes, a former Marine, clenched his fists, his breathing steady but measured. Lieutenant Eric Carter, an Air Force engineer, rubbed at his stubbled jaw, eyes darting between the live feed of the enemy fleet and the static-riddled diagnostics of their own battered defense grid. Sergeant Miguel Torres, weapons specialist, shifted from foot to foot, knuckles cracking. "Arrogant bastards," Hayes muttered, breaking the silence. "Not wrong," Carter said. "We've thrown everything at them already. Railguns, hypersonic missiles, high-energy lasers. They shrug it off like we're shooting BBs at a tank." Reynolds glanced at the screens. Reports from across the world told the same story. Every modern weapon had failed. Earth's satellites had been torn from the sky within minutes of first contact. Every counteroffensive had been neutralized before it could even gain momentum. Air superiority was a fantasy. Orbital defenses had been swatted aside with impunity. Humanity wasn't just losing. It wasn't even putting up a fight. "They're not invincible," Torres said, voice low. "Nothing is." Reynolds nodded slowly. The Empire's ships were enormous, plated in some alloy that dispersed energy-based attacks and absorbed electromagnetic pulses. Kinetic strikes, too, seemed ineffective. High-velocity rounds lost momentum before penetration, as if striking dense gravity pockets just before impact. "They studied us before they attacked," Reynolds said. "They knew exactly what we'd throw at them." Hayes ran a hand over his shaved head. "So what the hell do we hit them with?" Carter exhaled sharply, frustration evident. Something they didn't study. Reynolds was silent for a long moment. Then he turned to one of the junior officers. "Give me an inventory of every decommissioned anti-aircraft weapon in storage. I don't care if it's from Vietnam or World War II. I want a list of everything we've still got." The room went still. Carter blinked. "Sir." "Now, Lieutenant." Carter hesitated, then nodded, turning to a nearby terminal. Hayes crossed his arms, skepticism evident. "You really think dusting off some museum pieces is the answer?" Reynolds glanced at the ceiling, as if he could see through the layers of concrete and steel to the fleet above. "They built their defenses around what they thought we'd use," he said. "They prepared for our best. But what if we hit them with our past?" Torres grinned, catching on. They wouldn't have countermeasures for weapons they never thought to study. The bunker's tension shifted, uncertainty giving way to something else, possibility. Minutes later, Carter whistled. "Colonel, you're going to want to see this." Reynolds walked over, peering at the screen. Carter had pulled up an inventory list, a digital graveyard of decommissioned war machines. The numbers were staggering. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns, some dating back nearly a century. Surface-to-air missile systems, considered obsolete by modern warfare standards. Massive, rusting flak cannons sitting forgotten in depots. Reynolds's fingers tapped against the metal table. "How fast can we get these operational?" Carter hesitated. "Some of this stuff is ancient, sir. We're talking about systems that haven't been fired in decades, maybe longer." "Can you get them working?" Carter exhaled, scanning the specs. "With enough hands?" "Maybe. A lot of these old systems use mechanical targeting instead of digital. That could actually work in our favor. Means they won't be affected by EMPs or cyber warfare. But we'd have to retrofit everything. Do it. Reynolds turned to Torres. I want a test site prepped. Find something small we can hit first. A scout drone, a lander, anything. Torres grinned. On it. Hayes shook his head, a slow smirk forming. You're really doing this, huh? Reynolds met his gaze. Got a better idea? The Marine chuckled, rolling his shoulders. Nah, I just hope the brass doesn't have a heart attack when they see us rolling out 50-year-old flak cannons. Reynolds's expression was grim. Brass won't matter if we lose. Carter was already compiling teams, issuing orders to engineers and mechanics scattered across the bunker. Outside, the distant thunder of orbital bombardment continued. Another city was burning. Another nation falling silent. Reynolds turned back to the screen, watching the alien ships hover above the planet like indifferent gods. They thought humanity was finished. They had no idea what was coming. The first wave of recovery teams worked through the night, pulling tarps from rusted equipment and prying open long-sealed crates. Dust clouded the air, thick with the scent of oil and corrosion. In the dim light of hangars and underground storage facilities, forgotten giants of war saw daylight for the first time in decades. Colonel Reynolds moved between the workstations, eyes sweeping over the array of weapons being assessed. Rows of anti-aircraft guns, their barrels lined with rust and cobwebs, sat beside missile systems with faded stenciling and peeling paint. Engineers and technicians moved between them, stripping away years of neglect with grease-stained hands. The air buzzed with the sound of welding torches, power tools, and the low murmur of problem-solving. Carter knelt beside an old MIM-23 Hawk missile launcher, wiping grime from the control panel. This thing's practically a relic, he muttered. Early Cold War guidance systems, mechanical tracking, nothing networked, nothing automated. Which means it's immune to whatever electronic warfare they're running, Reynolds said. Carter exhaled, adjusting his grip on a wrench. Yeah, but it also means we're flying blind. No satellite tracking, no digital locks. We'll be manually guiding these. Hayes leaned against a rusted turret, arms crossed. Fine by me. We didn't need fancy guidance when we took down MiGs in Nam. Torres barked a laugh. Pretty sure none of us were alive for Nam, man. Hayes grinned. Point stands. Reynolds turned as one of the engineers called over, holding up a circuit board scavenged from a disassembled system. Colonel, a lot of these old guidance systems are shot. We might be able to retrofit some of them with modern processors, but we'd be Frankensteining everything together. Do it, Reynolds said. I don't care if it looks like a scrapyard special as long as it fires. Carter straightened, rubbing at the back of his neck. We're going to need gunners who can actually handle these things. Half these weapons require manual tracking, lead calculations, range adjustments, stuff most modern operators don't even train for. Reynolds glanced at the gathered soldiers. Then we find people who can. Any veterans who worked with these before, anyone from artillery units with experience on manual systems, pull them in. The engineers nodded and got back to work. Nearby, a team struggled to rotate the rusted barrel of a Bofors 40mm, gears grinding in protest. One of the younger soldiers grunted as he applied more force to a lever. Damn thing's locked up tight. Hayes walked over, rolling his shoulders. Move. He grabbed the lever, planted his boots, and wrenched it down. Metal groaned, then snapped loose with a screech. The barrel shifted slightly. The soldiers exchanged glances, then redoubled their efforts. By the time the sun rose, the first functional test was ready. A single M163 Vulcan, freshly cleaned and retrofitted, was hauled onto the testing range. The 6-barrel Gatling gun still looked ancient, its paint chipped and its frame worn, but the mechanics were sound. The team loaded a belt of 20mm rounds, calibrating what little electronics they could salvage. Torres climbed onto the platform, gripping the controls. He tested the movement, the old hydraulics whirring sluggishly before picking up speed. Damn, this thing's got some bite left. Reynolds stood behind a makeshift firing zone, watching as a captured enemy reconnaissance drone was released into the air. It was small, nimble, a sliver of reflective metal darting across the sky. The kind of thing that had been impossible to hit with modern automated tracking systems, designed to bypass infrared and radar locks. But this wasn't a digital engagement. Torres exhaled, lining up his shot. He squeezed the trigger. The Vulcan roared to life, belching fire as a stream of rounds tore through the sky. The first burst missed, but Torres adjusted on instinct, leading his shots just as the drone banked. The second burst struck home. The drone exploded in a burst of flame and shattered metal, its wreckage tumbling to the ground. A cheer rose from the gathered men. Hayes clapped a hand on Torres' shoulder. "Now that's how you shoot." Reynolds didn't smile. He turned to Carter. "Scale it up." The next few hours were a blur of activity. More weapons were pulled from storage, tested, modified. Old radar systems were repurposed for ground-based tracking, linked to crude but effective targeting networks. The problem wasn't just getting the weapons operational. It was ensuring they could coordinate, creating a defensive grid that didn't rely on modern technology. Reynolds watched as a team worked on an ancient M190mm anti-aircraft gun, adjusting its elevation gears and reinforcing its mounting. Carter oversaw the retrofitting of old SAM launchers, stripping away dead electronics and replacing them with manually controlled firing systems. Hayes ran drills with the gunners, forcing them to relearn skills that had been obsolete for generations. They had no precision-guided munitions, no real-time satellite tracking, no artificial intelligence running combat calculations. What they had were man machines and decades-old doctrines that had once torn apart enemy aircraft with brutal efficiency. By nightfall, the first offensive site was operational. An array of restored weapons, flak cannons, Vulcans, SAM launchers, stood ready, manned by soldiers who had spent the day relearning forgotten arts. Reynolds surveyed the setup, his gaze sweeping over the crude but functional defenses. It wasn't much. Against the overwhelming might of the Empire, it was barely a dent, but it was something. Carter wiped his hands on his fatigues, exhaustion lining his features. "This is a long shot, sir." Reynolds nodded. "Maybe, but I'd rather take a long shot than no shot." In the distance, the sky remained filled with the silent, looming shapes of the enemy warships. Unmoving, watching. They had no idea what was waiting for them. The night sky was fractured by the distant glow of fires, remnants of cities reduced to smoldering ruins. The Empire had not unleashed its full fury yet, but it didn't need to. Earth was already on its knees, the weight of an unstoppable force pressing down on every remaining pocket of resistance. Yet, in a valley carved by time and war, the last hope of defiance stood ready. Colonel Reynolds gripped the railing of the makeshift command post, eyes locked on the darkened horizon. The Empire's ships still hung in low orbit, silent, unchallenged. The enemy had not yet bothered to send another broadcast. Humanity's continued existence was, to them, an administrative detail, one that would be handled with the next wave of planetary cleansing. Carter crouched beside an old radar console, adjusting its frequency manually. The screen flickered, displaying crude tracking data fed from repurposed Cold War systems. "They're sending scout vessels," he reported. "Smaller crafts, fast-moving. Looks like a reconnaissance sweep before the main push." Reynolds nodded. The enemy was still operating under the assumption that Earth's defenses were crippled. It was a mistake they wouldn't make twice. Hayes stood nearby, checking the ammunition feeds on a restored M167 Vulcan. His movements were practiced, methodical. "Think they'll take the bait?" he asked without looking up. They won't see it as bait, Reynolds replied. They'll see it as a mop-up operation. A few hundred tons of firepower left over from a primitive war. Torres grinned as he settled behind the controls of an M190mm gun, its long barrel silhouetted against the night sky. Let's make regret underestimating primitives. The valley was lined with batteries of flak cannons, missile launchers, and rapid-fire anti-aircraft weapons, all hidden beneath tarps and natural cover. Without active electronic signatures, the weapons were effectively invisible to the Empire's scanning methods. No advanced targeting systems, no network defenses, just men, steel, and powder. Carter adjusted his headset, voice tight. They're closing in. The first wave came low and fast. Sleek, insectal crafts shimmered as they descended, their metallic bodies reflecting Earth's fires below. They moved with a confidence earned from invulnerability, their pilots unprepared for what waited in the darkness. Reynolds raised his hand, fingers tightening into a fist. Torres fired first. The valley erupted in thunder. A single 90mm shell punched through the sky, trailing fire as it climbed. The nearest enemy craft barely had time to react before the round struck home, detonating against its forward plating. A flash of light, then a plume of debris spiraled downward. The other weapons followed a heartbeat later. Vulcan cannons roared, their rotating barrels spitting out walls of steel. The sky became a storm of tracers, shells crisscrossing in arcs of red and orange. Missiles, fired from repurposed SAM launchers, streaked upward in unpredictable paths, their guidance purely mechanical. The first wave of alien ships had no countermeasures prepared. They banked sharply, their hulls shimmering as they tried to activate energy dispersal systems, but flak didn't care about energy shielding. Shrapnel burst in wide arcs, ripping through their airframes, shredding wings, piercing engines. One by one, the ships fell. Some exploded midair, torn apart by direct hits. Others spiraled down in flames, smashing into the earth below in plumes of fire and twisted metal. Reynolds didn't flinch as the wreckage rained down. "Keep firing," he ordered. Hayes grinned, gripping the controls of his Vulcan as he adjusted his fire. "With pleasure." The second wave arrived with more caution. The remaining scout ships broke formation, maneuvering erratically. They weren't running. They were analyzing, recalibrating. The enemy had finally realized something was wrong. Carter's voice was sharp. "They're adapting." Reynolds had expected that. The Empire wasn't stupid, just overconfident. Now that the element of surprise was gone, the battle would change. The enemy would adjust their tactics, deploy countermeasures. The question wasn't whether they would adapt. It was whether they could adapt fast enough. Torres fired again, but this time, the alien craft jerked midair, twisting away from the shell at the last second. Their movements were faster, more erratic, their evasive patterns shifting. They were learning. "Switch to spread fire," Reynolds ordered. "Box them in." The gunners adjusted, altering their aim. Instead of focusing on single targets, they fired in staggered bursts, saturating the air with metal. The Empire's pilots were fast, but they weren't prepared for the sheer volume of firepower. A ship tried to climb out of range, only to be caught in a flak burst, its fuselage torn apart by shrapnel. Another banked left to avoid incoming fire, directly into the path of a missile fired from an ancient Hawk launcher. The second wave fell. Silence returned to the valley, the echoes of gunfire fading into the night. The air reeked of gunpowder, smoke curling upward from overheated barrels. The remaining operators exhaled, hands shaking, sweat dripping down their brows. Carter wiped a hand over his face, his breath unsteady. "We just did that." Reynolds nodded once. "And now they know we can." Hayes cracked his knuckles. "Let him come. We'll just keep knocking them down." Reynolds stared up at the sky. his expression unreadable. No, that was the last time they'll come in blind. The Empire had lost 2 waves of ships, but it wouldn't make the same mistake again. The next attack wouldn't be scouts. It wouldn't be a probing strike. It would be an extermination. And the valley, no matter how many guns it held, wouldn't survive it. Torres exhaled, running a hand through his sweat-damp hair. So what's the plan, Colonel? Reynolds didn't look away from the sky. He could already see the distant glow of something larger moving into position, something vast, ancient, and filled with a fury that came only from wounded pride. "We hit them first," he said. The air was thick with the metallic scent of gunpowder and the acrid burn of overheated steel. Spent shell casings littered the ground, still warm beneath the boots of men who had just defied the might of the Galactic Empire. The valley's defenses had held, but Reynolds knew that was only the beginning. The real fight was coming, and when it did, it would not be fought on their terms. Carter adjusted the frequency on the radar console, his fingers tense against the worn dials. The screen flickered, distorting as interference bled through the signal. "They're jamming us," he muttered. "I can't get a clear read, but something massive is moving in." Hayes tightened his grip on his rifle, eyes flicking between the darkened sky and the colonel. "Reckon this is it then?" Reynolds nodded once. "They're done playing." A deep rumble vibrated through the earth as the sky above them shifted. The first sign was not a fleet of incoming fighters, but the growing shadow that swallowed the stars. The Empire's warship, a behemoth of gleaming black metal, descended with the weight of inevitability. It was unlike anything that had come before. No small, maneuverable scout ships, no overconfident fighter pilots. This was a planetary siege engine, a floating fortress designed for annihilation. Torres exhaled sharply. Hell of a thing. The warship's underside split open, and the valley was cast in crimson light as its weapons powered up. This wasn't just an attack, it was an execution. The orbital cannons hummed, energy coalescing in their barrels. The next blast wouldn't be aimed at individual weapons or scattered resistance. It would scour the entire valley from existence. Reynolds didn't hesitate. "Fire everything." The valley erupted. Every anti-aircraft battery, every missile system, every remaining round was hurled skyward in defiance. Tracer fire slashed against the darkness, missiles spiraled upward, and flak rounds burst into lethal clouds of shrapnel. The sky became a war zone, filled with the violent cacophony of steel meeting the impossible. The warship's shields flared, its energy dispersing incoming rounds like rain against armor. The smaller crafts had been vulnerable, but this was the might of an empire distilled into a single vessel. No single shot could bring it down, but they weren't aiming for a single shot. Reynolds' voice cut through the chaos. "Keep hitting the same spot. Focus fire." Torres swung the 90mm cannon, leading his shot just ahead of the warship's forward thrusters. He fired. The first round slammed against the shield, barely leaving a scorch mark. The second hit a fraction of a second later, followed by another and another. The rest of the valley followed suit, sending everything they had into one concentrated point of impact. Carter's eyes were locked on the radar. "We're overloading it." The warship shuddered. Its shields, designed to absorb and disperse energy-based weaponry, weren't built for this kind of primitive, relentless kinetic bombardment. The impact zone flickered, cracks forming in the shimmering energy barrier. The Empire had designed their defenses for laser strikes and directed energy attacks. They had never anticipated an onslaught of raw, unrelenting firepower from weapons built in a time when war was fought with gunpowder and steel. The first hole in the shield was small, almost imperceptible, but Hayes saw it. "There. Light it up." The next barrage punched through. A missile from a Hawk launcher followed, spiraling into the exposed section of the warship's hull. The explosion rippled outward, sending debris cascading into the sky. The warship recoiled, its thrusters adjusting, trying to stabilize. Reynolds didn't let up. Again. All batteries, same spot. The gunners reloaded, their hands moving on instinct. Another flak burst erupted in the weakened section, followed by armor-piercing rounds from an M51 Skysweeper. The damage spread like a crack through glass. The warship's underbelly buckled. Smoke and fire gushed from within. Then, the real damage took hold. The ship's thrusters stuttered. A chain reaction of detonations coursed through its lower decks, ignited by the relentless impact of old-world artillery. The warship listed, its descent no longer controlled. Carter gripped the railing as the radar display spiked. It's going down. The behemoth tilted, its nose pitching forward. The Empire had never considered such an outcome. Their weapons were beyond human comprehension. Their ships were invincible. Their dominance was absolute. And yet here they were. The warship crashed. The impact shook the ground for miles, a shockwave tearing through the valley as metal crumpled and flames erupted into the sky. The wreckage burned, a grave marker for Imperial arrogance. Silence followed, stretching between the men as they stared at the impossible made real. The warship, the embodiment of the Empire's power, lay in ruins. The valley still stood. Hayes let out a low whistle. You think they got the message? Torres exhaled, running a hand over his soot-streaked face. If they didn't, we can send another. Reynolds turned his gaze upward. The stars were still filled with enemy ships. This wasn't the end. The Empire would regroup. They would analyze, adapt, retaliate. But something fundamental had changed. Humanity wasn't just surviving. They were fighting back. And the Empire, for the first time, had been forced to bleed. Carter closed his eyes for a moment, exhaustion settling in. So what now, Colonel? Reynolds took a slow breath, his voice steady. Now, he looked at the wreckage, at the weapons still hot from battle, at the men who had just rewritten history with their own hands. Now we make them afraid.